Now that you know how to draw basic shapes on your artboard, it's important that we also introduce the basic transformations that you can make to those shapes or elements that you create on the artboard. So this Illustrator demo is basic transformations. We're going to talk about the tools located here, the rotate and reflect tool, the scale, shear, and reshape tools, and also the free transform tool. In addition, we will show you how to transform by menu located under Object and Transform. So let's create some basic shapes that we can work with. I'm going to set some parameters here, something that you can see easily in the demo. And I'm just going to draw a basic rectangle here on the artboard. Whee, there it is. Okay, so here's your basic rectangle. Now, we've already talked about scaling and rotating. You can do that if you have the direct selection tool and you get this type of a bounding box. And if you hover over those specific highlighted bounding box points, you can scale, or if you hover over a edge point, you can rotate. But that's all around that very specific center point that you're rotating or scaling around. Now, what if you wanted to do something more specific? Let's say, for example, you wanted to rotate this rectangle by this particular axis. You can do that by setting an access point using the rotate tool. So I'm going to select my rotate tool. Now you can see my access point is located in the center by default, but I want to change it to this axis point right here, the X and Y axis point. Now if I click on this object and drag, I rotate that specific object around that new selected axis point. Very handy tool at times. If I hold the Shift key down, it's going to constrain my rotation to specifically 90-degree angles. So that's just another little oddity that you might want to be aware of, as opposed to just a free form click and drag which goes all the way around that axis point. Okay, so that is exciting and interesting. But you could also reflect an object. So I'm going to draw something here. Let's say I want to draw a rounded rectangle tool. I click and drag on the artboard. There it is. But what if I wanted to, for some reason, let's say maybe it contains something. Let's say there's a photograph here, and the people in the photograph are facing the wrong way. Let's say they're facing out of frame, that they're looking off the artboard to the left. What if I wanted them to face the other way? Well, then I could reflect this item. And I can choose the reflect tool, and if I click once, I set the point upon which I want this to reflect. If I click and drag, now that item is reflected. It's probably a little easier to see in an oddly shaped item, so let me just quickly add to this. I'm going to create a polygon, and I'm going to make this a more complex shape so that you can really see what this reflect does. I'm just going to, let's just group these for now. So I have this group object on the artboard and I want to reflect it. So I'm going to choose my reflect tool, and I will select the item I want to reflect. Select the reflect tool. Sorry, there is a specific order in which to do this, and I want to reflect it back going this direction. So I'm going to set my point, my axis point here, and now if I click and drag, you can see that it constrained that item to reflecting in this direction. Especially if I hold the Shift key down, it really constrains that and doesn't allow me to spin it around in any way. So that can be a very powerful tool. If you have created something on the artboard and you decide, oops, I need it to face a different direction, you can use the reflect tool to do that. Now, the scale tool is a little bit different from the direct selection tool, but it's also very much the same. So let's say I have this polygon on the stage, and I'm kind of going to move it into the center here. Of course, I can scale it by doing this, but let's say I've done a couple of other things. Let's draw another shape. And then I've got something else going on down here, some text. It's down at the bottom. Okay, so I've got other things going on, and then I decide, you know what? I think that I'd really like for that polygon to be a lot smaller. I can select it, and then I can click on the scale tool, and it lets me set the point at which I want to scale it, which is different from the direct selection tool, which always uses the default center for scaling. If I actually choose scale and I want it to scale, let's say, by this axis point, it's going to constrain my scale to this point. Now if I click and drag, it's scaling from that point only, as opposed to the default center. So it will behave slightly differently from the direct selection tool default scales that you have available to you. Another kind of a cool shape that you can make is using the shear tool. If you wanted to make maybe some interesting button tabs that were less boring than your average rectangular shape, you might want to use something like the shear tool. The shear tool, I can again change the axis point, and if I click and drag, it changes that rectangular shape, or it shears it. It gives it kind of a lean-to, makes it lean to the side. So that's kind of a cool and handy thing when you need a little variety in your shapes. Shear tool can be very powerful for something like that. And then the reshape tool is primarily used for, let's say you had created a line on the artboard and you decided that you wanted it to be actually a curved Bezier curve line. So if you click and drag and create this line on the artboard, and then if I choose my reshape tool, I come in, click on that line, and drag, and it converts it to a curved line. So the reshape tool is primarily used to quickly reshape something without spending too much time adjusting the very specifics of that curve. Of course, if you didn't get what you wanted with the reshape tool, you could go back in with your direct selection tool and you could really, adjust those specific curves even further. But if you just needed something quick and dirty, quickly reshape something, the reshape tool can be handy for that. Now here's something else interesting. Notice how these are behaving a little bit differently from the shape tools. The shape tools, if I have them selected and I click once on the stage, it brings up the dialog box in which I can put my specific parameters. Okay. However, some of these transform tools behave a little differently. I can't set specific parameters by clicking once because that actually allows me only to set my axis point. If I click once on the artboard, that just lets me move around the axis point upon which I want the transform to take place. So if that's the case, how do I set specific parameters? To set those specific parameters, you have to access it through the drop-down menu. So now if I wanted to make, let's see, things are getting a little confusing here on the stage. Now let's say I needed to do something to this particular rectangle, but I wanted to do something very specific. Maybe I wanted to rotate it by an exact amount of degrees. I would actually go under Object, Transform, Rotate, and there I have my dialog box. So if you need to put in specific parameters for the transformations, you have to use the Transform drop-down menu under Object and Transform. And then I could set, okay, I want to make this very specifically 90-degree angle, rotation, click OK. There is something that's very powerful. So there's a little bit of differentiation between these transform tools and the shape tools. Now the other thing to bring up is the free transform tool. The free transform tool, when selected, if I have an object selected on the stage and I use free transform, it's similar to bringing up what the selection tool does, and that allows me to click and drag and transform this object. Now this is called a free transform. It defaults to the axis point being in the middle, and it's great for quick and dirty changes if I didn't have, real specific things that I needed to do and I just was kind of freehand drawing. So that can be very powerful, particularly if your direct selection tool, if you have the free transform tool preference turned off and you really needed to access that, you can always access this look of the free transform object with that bounding box, the familiarity of hovering over the corner and getting the rotation tool, or hovering over an endpoint to click and drag and free transform that object. You can do that by simply selecting the free transform tool in the toolbar. So this is just your basic introduction to these transformations, but I encourage you to experiment with these, do more with your shape building, and try to bring up the dialog box and set some very specific parameters under Object Transform. You can see all of the transforms come back here, but you can make some very specific parameters set in the dialog box. And this concludes our introduction to basic transformations.